Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning?
Welcome to a new episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast. I'm Yusuf.
I'm Alexandria.
And I'm Mert.
Together, we'll guide you through a 360-degree perspective on the human rights situation since October 7th in Gaza, Israel, the West Bank, Germany, the US, and Iran. Today, we're honored to have two extraordinary guests joining us for this conversation. Please welcome Dr. Agnès Callamard, Secretary General of Amnesty International, a leading global human rights expert and former Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. She is also the former director of the Columbia University Global Freedom of Expression Project and is internationally recognized for leading the UN investigation into the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
Please also welcome Dr. Julia Duchrow, Secretary General of Amnesty International Germany, a distinguished human rights expert and legal scholar. She previously led the Policy and Advocacy Division at Amnesty Germany and served as Head of Human Rights and Peace at Brot für die Welt. Dr. Duchrow has also represented Germany on the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency board and advised the German Foreign Office on civilian crisis prevention.
Thank you both so much for coming here.
Getting right into the first question. Let's begin with the devastating current situation in Gaza. How would you assess it, not only in terms of humanitarian suffering, but also regarding international humanitarian law and human rights law? And what are the obligations of all parties under international law in a situation of this nature?
Thank you very much, Yusuf. Look, for Amnesty International, the assessment is sadly very straightforward. We are being made the witness every day of a genocide, the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. We have published a report in December of some 300 pages detailing the genocidal act being committed and explaining that there is an intention on the part of Israel to commit genocide. Since the launch of the report, I think the world has become more and more aware of the intensity of the mass killings that are taking place and the suffering being imposed on Palestinian people. We are witnessing starvation. I was just reading something just now about the multiplication of cases of starvation of all ages, massive displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. We know that since the beginning of the year, the Israeli authority have completely leveled out what was left of Gaza City. In many neighborhoods are now absolutely groundless. There is nothing left. We also know that the targeted killings of Palestinians have not stopped at all, including through aerial bombing. We have also been the witness of the Hunger Game being played out by Israel, whereby Palestinians have basically to die in order to get food. So the nightmare experienced by Palestinian children, men and women, seem to go no end. That is what we know is happening. It is a violation of international law, even if you don't want to use the word genocide. We are witnessing lots of war crimes, and that should be enough for the international community to react. War crimes after war crimes after war crimes. We believe that it amounts to genocide, but even if you do not believe that it amounts to genocide, you still have an obligation to act. And right now, the international community is failing to act, to prevent genocide and to save the lives of Palestinians.
Given the catastrophic scale of suffering and destruction, what mechanisms exist to hold perpetrators, whether state actors or non-state actors such as Hamas, accountable for violations of international law?
We have a mechanism. So let me describe them quickly, because right now they're not working. We first have an International Court of Justice that has been called upon by South Africa to determine whether a genocide is taking place. In January 2024, the International Court of Justice concluded, after 3 months of attacks, concluded that there were serious risk of genocide and called on the international community to take all necessary measures to prevent genocide. It is an international obligation under the Genocide Convention that was adopted in 1948, immediately or in the aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II. That decision from the International Court of Justice has not been implemented. In other words, no governments are taking enough steps, or no steps at all, in fact, to prevent the crime of genocide from being committed. The International Court of Justice, them again, in July of last year, 2024, issued an advisory opinion on the unlawfulness of Israel military occupation and apartheid, based on international law and based on decisions made before them by the Security Council and by the General Assembly. Since then, so it's basically 1 year ago, no action had been taken on the basis of that advisory opinion, which called on all governments of the world to basically end trade with the occupied territory. Some governments have done that, but the vast majority of governments have not done it. Second action that have not being implemented. Third instrument is the International Criminal Court. We know that there are currently 2 arrest warrants against Israeli officials and 3 arrest warrants against Hamas officials. The Hamas officials are now dead, killed by Israeli. The Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, are very much alive. They should be the object of indictment in front of the International Criminal Court. They should be pursued by governments around the world. The opposite is happening. Netanyahu is being invited by Donald Trump and by Hungary, among other states. In addition, the United States has started sanctioning the International Criminal Court prosecutor and 4 judges for daring to indict Prime Minister Netanyahu. So you have here 3 remarkable mechanisms that are either being ignored or are literally being threatened. That is the source of the problem. It is not that we don't have mechanisms. We have them, but the international community and most crucially, the powerful state in that community are doing everything they can to ensure that those mechanisms do not work. There should be a 4th one, which is the Security Council. I don't think I have to elaborate too much on the fact that it is paralyzed, unable to take action on the genocide of Palestinians and unable to take action, in fact, on major crises because of the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So that's the situation. There are mechanisms. They cannot be implemented. International mechanisms. At national levels, we have more. Germany has a very good universal jurisdiction system that they could put in place to pursue all those responsible for war crimes, whether they are IDF soldiers or indeed Hamas or other Palestinian groups. That too is not being implemented by any countries at the moment, with a few exceptions. If we have the time, I can talk about
it. How does the situation in Gaza compare in scope, severity, and legal gravity to other major crises, such as those in Sudan, Tigray, and Ukraine?
Well, I mean, we don't really rank crisis, I will say. They are all equally important, certainly for the victims. And for us at Amnesty, we don't rank them. And under international law, let me add that there is no hierarchy. So a war crime is as important as a genocide, basically. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. What I think stand apart as far as Gaza is concerned are a few things. First of all, the severity and the scale of what's happening. According to historians of war, since World War II, there has not been any other situations where the scale of killings and the severity of the destruction have been as high as in Gaza. So we need to highlight that in proportion of the population, of course. We need to highlight that. Second, I don't think there has been any other conflict where day after day we can watch what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza. It's every minute of their ordeal is being broadcasted by themselves, or by others. We are all made the silent or the powerless witness of massive killings. And I think that is also quite, it stands apart as far as Gaza is concerned. Thirdly, I cannot recall any other conflict in my lifetime that has generated such commitment on the part of the population around the world. For the last 20 months, almost every week, we've had massive protests around the world. In Europe, in the United States, in South Africa, in the Arab world, everywhere. So that also is something that is, I will say, quite striking about the situation in Gaza right now. But the severity, the scale, and the publicity, it is what is really standing apart for Gaza. And I don't know whether Julia has any other views about it, but that, to me, is what is making Gaza really stand apart.
Turning to the October 7th attacks by Hamas, which involved mass killings, hostage-taking, and acts of sexual violence against civilians. How should these acts be understood and categorized under international law? What legal frameworks apply and what responsibilities arise for the international community?
Well, the international has been investigating the crimes committed on October 7 for the last 12 months. We started before, but really focused investigation, and we will be issuing a full-blown report in a couple of weeks. What I can tell you is that there is absolutely no doubt that what was committed by Hamas amounts to atrocity crimes, and in the first place, crimes against humanity. In other words, There are crimes that have been committed that were committed in a systematic and organized way. That includes killings, that includes act of torture, and so on and so forth. So these are crimes Hamas committed, in Amnesty's opinion, crimes against humanity. We explored whether or not they committed genocide, and we did not find sufficient evidence for genocidal intent. But crimes against humanity leaves no doubt. War crimes leaves no doubt. And having read our report, the one that will be published in a few weeks, I can assure you these were atrocious crimes that were committed against mostly Israelis, but not only in those areas. So the legal framework that applies is the same that applies to Gaza. It's international law, international humanitarian law, and accountability for those crimes.
If I may follow up, Dr. Callamard.
Yeah.
In a recent interview with the German weekly Die Zeit, world-leading genocide scholar Omar Bartov referred to the October 7th attacks as an act of genocidal violence, referring to the blatantly anti-Semitic original Hamas charter. Could you share your perspective on this?
The genocidal act have occurred. I think I personally will not disagree with that. It doesn't mean that it amounts to genocide. We need to understand, and in fact, your source did not say genocide. He said genocidal violence. For the determination of genocide to happen, you need to prove genocidal intent. And that we could not, at least at Amnesty, we could not find evidence to suggest that there was genocidal intent. The fact that there is one document amounting to a call for genocide does not amount to, or is not good enough to conclude genocidal intent. Look, when we looked at Israel, we did not just look at one document. We did not just look at one speech. We looked at hundreds. And it is the combination of all those speeches that allows you to determine whether genocidal intent was there. And there is no doubt that if you look back at what Hamas or other Palestinian groups have said, there is no doubt that you will find text that may amount to intending to commit genocide. But one text or one speech is not enough to conclude that a genocide has taken place.
What is the ongoing human rights impact of the October 7th attack on Israeli civilians? How are hostages, survivors, their relatives, and displaced families affected? And what potential longer-term consequences do you see for Israeli society as a whole, whether social, political, or psychological?
Thank you. I will start and then I'll give the floor to Julia because she actually met hostage families in Israel a year ago. So as some of your listeners may know, on October 7th, a large number of individuals were taken hostage by Hamas or the other Palestinian groups involved. At the moment, we believe that there are about 42 hostage left in Gaza. Hostage taking is a war crime, and Amnesty International has been calling for their release unconditionally. That is, we do not believe that a ceasefire is required for the hostage to be released. The lives of the family left behind must be, they live in constant fear. They live in constant pain. It's suffering for anyone who knows that their loved one is being held in in an extraordinarily difficult, dangerous environment by people who may wish them dead. So it's not for me to tell you what they feel. It's for them to tell you actually directly, but I can only imagine the level of pain and suffering that they are experiencing. And Julia, I know that you met some of them personally, so maybe you can add something.
Yeah, I met when I was in Israel in January 2024. I met a released hostage. And first of all, I was very impressed actually by her openness, tenderness, also to speak with our colleagues, also Palestinian colleagues, and sharing her feelings. And she had her situation was when she was taken hostage really terrible because she thought her husband died. And she had one child with her from a neighbor and three children by her own. And she was kept 40 days not knowing that her husband survived, fortunately. And and experienced darkness and so on. And also a big fear from the bombing and the destruction, from the IDF forces. And so I think the situation for hostages is really terrible, and also for the families of the hostages, because they hope and fought, and so many went on the streets for so many months and so many weeks, hoping that the war stops and that there is an agreement for hostages to be released, and it didn't happen yet. So it is a terrible situation, and that's why taking hostages is a war crime, as it targets civilians.
How would you describe Hamas's human rights records in Gaza prior to October 7th? And how was the situation evolved since then, particularly in light of recent protests against Hamas?
Well, so Amnesty International has been monitoring violations by Hamas since Hamas has been in power in Gaza. So I think the main violations that have been committed have been violations on freedom of expression, freedom of association, peaceful assembly, excessive use of force against protesters, the use of torture of dissident, and labeling critics as a traitor. They've also in the past taken very strong position against same-sex conduct, very, very anti-LGBTQI. They certainly have death penalty. They've executed people in the past, and they've done so again at the beginning of October, immediately after the October 7 attack. And since then, it has not really dominated anyone's agenda, I will say, including Palestinians. But over the last few months, we have received and documented reports of renewed violations by Hamas against individuals in Gaza who are basically arguing that Hamas is not representing Palestinians and that they should not continue the way they are behaving. We've documented arbitrary arrest. We've documented torture as well over the last, I will say, few weeks. 8 weeks or so. A new surge, I will say, of violations of Palestinians by Hamas.
How is the human rights situation evolving in the West Bank since October 7th, and has the human rights situation within Israel itself changed?
First, let's put the record straight. Under the International Court of Justice decision of July 2024, under a variety of Security Council and UN General Assembly resolutions. The situation in West Bank and East Jerusalem amounts to unlawful occupation by Israel. Okay, so I think it's really important to understand that this is not a choice by Amnesty or other human rights people. This is an internationally grounded assessment that the West Bank and East Jerusalem are unlawfully occupied by Israel. In addition, Amnesty has also concluded that the situation amounts to apartheid. And so did the ICJ. In July, they've concluded that the occupied territories are unlawfully occupied and constitute a regime of apartheid. So that's, I think, important to understand. And frankly, the situation there has sharply deteriorated since October 7. There has been tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank that have been forcibly destroyed, that have been forcibly displaced. Their homes have been destroyed. Their businesses have been destroyed. Their lands, their farming lands have been taken over. There are 2 refugee camps that have been basically made emptied out, Jenin and Tul Karem. They are uninhabitable right now because of the violence of the IDF. There are tanks that are posted almost everywhere. There has been air strikes against Palestinians. And of course, as we have noticed, because the media reported on it, there is more and more violence by private actors. Who do I mean? The settlers. The Israeli settlers are taking, are using their own weapon to attack Palestinians, and usually Israeli forces do nothing to stop them. And in fact, in many occasions, they actually support them. So that's what we are detailing. We are detailing an acceleration as well of the number of settlement, which means that this occupied territory is becoming less and less Palestinian and more Israeli. And of course, people are dying. They're dying because they are shot, they are killed by Israeli forces or by settlers, the latest of whom was, in fact, an American Palestinian young man who was beaten to death by settlers just a few days ago.
Okay. Turning to Europe.
Okay. Turning to Europe, particularly Germany, serious concerns have been raised about restrictions on pro-Palestinian speech and demonstrations. The Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe, Michael O'Flaherty, sharply criticized the German government for excessive police violence, including against minors, and for serious infringement on freedom of expression and assembly. How do you perceive the current state of civil liberties and free speech in Germany in this context?
Yeah, I'm going to take over here for a little bit. So the worldwide Palestinian solidarity movements and demonstrations have been under pressure. But in Germany, the restrictions have been the most severe. That's why this letter was written. I think it's a very important move of Michael O'Flaherty to confront the German government with these criticisms. And so those restrictions have been on various levels. One is the crackdown on demonstrations. So it's a violation of the freedom of assembly, and this is done by blanket bans of the demonstrations, but also by excessive use of police force. And the second area of repression is concerning the freedom of expression and within events, for example, and public events and public situations where people have been disinvited, like Masha Gessen, but also other known people. Places have not given their rooms, or like events were not allowed to take place, like the Congress that happened. And I think it's important to see that these crackdowns are not only, on long run, will not only focus on Palestine solidarity movement for Palestine, but those are elements of crackdowns and authoritarian practices which will restrict civil society space as a whole. And I'd like to give examples again to make it more like concrete examples which show, how this repression takes place. So the first one is when Hamas was banned in Germany by the Ministry of Interior in 2023. So Hamas was banned as terrorist organization, and with it, the slogan "from the river to the sea," that part was banned as terrorist symbol. And we have experienced that, like, for example, people using it, demonstrators using this slogan on demonstrations were then experienced repressive violence by the police. And there have been various court cases on this slogan, and there hasn't been a consistent decision making on the slogan as to see if it's a really danger, incitement, or whatever to the situation, and if it's illegal or not. And now this sentence is before the federal court for decision. A second example is the treatment of Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation in occupied Palestinian territory. She came to Germany. She's a UN mandate, like a person mandated, or you say that in English, by the UN, by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and she came to speak about international public law. And so she was not allowed to speak at the Freie Universität of Berlin. The event was cancelled. And also in Munich, she wasn't allowed. In Berlin, she was then, the whole event was had to take place in the rooms of a newspaper. And I was personally present there. It was really incredible. There were 6 police vans with a lot of policemen and women in there. And then in the room of the newspaper, we had police officers with very strongly dressed, and it was clear that if any word would be problematic, the whole event would be cancelled. And I find that really problematic because she represents the UN and she has the right to speak. And it was a whole event with different speakers talking about international law. And I think the criminalization of such events with the argumentation they are anti-Semitic or terrorist are very problematic and violate the freedom of expression. And a last example maybe in that regard is the example of the ban of languages at demonstrations. This has happened that in Germany, lately demonstrations were only allowed, or demonstrators were only allowed to use German or English and not Hebrew, not Arabic. Were not allowed to speak in their language. And that is really problematic. As you know, it's important to speak your own language or the language you want to speak on demonstrations. And also that is probably, it has been, courts have been called to clarify that. We'll see that, but it is a violation of the freedom of expression.
Since October 7th, there has been a dramatic global rise in anti-Semitism and racism. At the same time, we're witnessing an alarming crackdown on students and academic institutions in the US. The Jewish Council for Public Affairs has criticized the Trump administration for instrumentalizing legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism to justify authoritarian policies that undermine the rule of law and make Jewish communities less safe. In Berlin, 4 student activists, 2 of them EU citizens, are currently threatened with deportation for their participation in pro-Palestinian protests. Could you comment on these developments from a human rights perspective?
Yes. So generally, we see that the authoritarian playbook, for example, the Trump administration uses, is to weaponize immigration law to silence uncomfortable protests or expressions. And one element also of the authoritarian playbook is that the executive, so an administration, goes over the law and just says, "Well, we'll see if a court then will criticize afterwards this executive behavior." And I think in that line we have to see those expulsions of the or the deportation orders which were issued towards those protesters in Germany. There was no basis, there was no criminal court case or decision taken. It was prior to that, and they were just deported. And we know now that within the administration, there were government officials saying, no, this is not legal, but it was still done. And now the court, in a summary decision, has decided, no, this has been an illegal form of deportation order. And it was not legal. And it was, so I find that really problematic, as it is a path. Also, the German government in parts of our areas is taking to say, we don't respect the law. We just break the law and then we'll see what courts will do. And this is very, very problematic. And it was, so I think a second area where I think this is problematic is in the whole area of there have been resolutions in Parliament defining when, for example, financial support can be given to cultural institutions or cultural events, and also to universities. And those resolutions which have been passed in Parliament, generally, they don't have a legal effect. You see, they have no legal, it's not a law or anything. It's just an executive decision, or this time then legitimized by the Parliament. And they use a definition of anti-Semitism, because this is important. We would, as Amnesty International, we want to combat anti-Semitism, and we think it's important to go against racism and all forms which are violating the rights of people and which are discriminatory. But this form we see that in Germany, but also in the US, because you referred to the Trump administration, the combating anti-Semitism is used to bring in restrictive orders which also restrict the freedom of expression. And the problematic, or the part which is problematic from the view of Amnesty International, is that a definition is used widely in Germany, but also in Europe, is the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, the IRA definition for what is anti-Semitic. And it is problematic when it comes to criticism of the Israeli government, when it criticizes the, not the behavior, but acts of the Israeli government, because they very easily are being told to be anti-Semitic. And even the drafters of these definitions have been refraining, because they said it goes too far, it's not used in a proper way. And there are other definitions, for example, the Jerusalem Declaration, which really defines well, where is criticism of the politics of the Israeli government allowed, or possible criticism which have got nothing to do with a discriminatory way of and hatred or way of being anti-Semitic, which targets civil society or people, Jewish people. And I think, it is we have a development here in Germany which is really problematic. And as I said, it is gonna have an effect on our on the open civil society in general, and rooms for debate and open discussions with opinions we sometimes don't like, but we still need those open spaces.
Proceed.
Do you assess, how do you assess the recent Iran-Israel war and its impact on civilians on both sides. How do you evaluate Iran's explicit calls for elimination of Israel, as well as the adherence of both countries to international law and international humanitarian law, particularly regarding the protection of civilians?
Agnès, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I can. So look, I think both Israel and Iran have demonstrated utter disregard for international human rights and humanitarian law, and for the protection of people, I will say, and civilians. So we at Amnesty we have reported on attacks by Israel against Iranian civilians and civilian infrastructures, including Evin prison. And we have also reported on attacks by Iran against Israeli civilian infrastructures, including the clinic, hospital. So both sides are equally violating international law and targeting civilians. In terms of the call by the that's what you said, the call by the Iranian look, no one should make a call regarding the annihilation of a country, or indeed against its people, or against the people. It's particularly important if you are a head of state and if you are a political leader. You should refrain from incitement to violence, including against the elimination of Israel, which is something that we hear frequently. But we also hear frequently calls for the elimination of Palestinians in Gaza, or suggestions that there is no such thing as a Palestinian culture, and so on and so forth. So on that issue, I will say our world is full of behaviors from Iran to Israel, including the United States, that are in violation of international law. And the world is full of calls and speech by representatives of those countries that are in violation of basic principles of international law, so basic principles of humanity, I will say. So I think that's all I have to say.
Dr. Callamard, for our listeners and for the sake of clarification, may we follow up quickly on the ICJ advisory opinion on the occupied territories? Thank you. According to the legal scholar Klaus Kress, whom we interviewed in the past, the ICJ only acknowledged a clear violation of ICERD Article 3 for the occupied territories. Regarding apartheid, it only reflects a controversial discussion between the judges. Is that right?
Not according to our assessment and analysis of the ICJ advisory opinion. First of all, the ICJ has based its opinion on a variety of international sources, including that related to self-determination. So the ICJ, in its advisory opinion, is referring to binding norms of international law, not just those related to non-discrimination. It has referred to, let me see, some of the sources that are behind the decisions are multiple, not just the principle of non-discrimination. For instance, that of self-determination, and that of the resolution of the Security Council from 2016, and so on and so forth. So when the ICJ put forward the various sources of international law, it is restating applicable international obligation. And that means that the opinion that is being given is not just an advice, it is binding because it is predicated on binding international norm. There will be, for many months to come, differences of views as to whether the ICJ opinion is binding. There is no doubt in Amnesty's mind that while it is an advisory opinion, to the extent that the ICJ is referring to expressly norms of international law, these are not just advisory, these become binding. That is why for Amnesty and for me, I think your scholar, with all due respect, is a minority there. For the vast majority of scholars of international law, what the ICJ has delivered in July is an absolute strong conclusion that Israel is violating international law through its current occupation of the West Bank and of East Jerusalem. There is absolutely no doubt in our mind, and whether it's based on third or something else, it is in violation of international law. It's unlawful, and Israel must free that territory. It is it needs to go. It should not be where it is now. This is that simple. It just should not be in that territory. And it's not rocket science. Now, what's happening is that you have a number of politicians, including Israel and the United States, that get stuck. They get stuck because international law is very clear on many issues. And so what do? They just tell you international law needs to go. This is why we're living such a difficult moment right now and such a serious situation. In 1948, and you're German, so you know the importance of what happened after World War II. On the ashes of World War II, on the ashes of the Holocaust, we built a new system. We built a new system beginning with the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations and the Geneva Convention. Those in 1948. These are exactly the mechanism and the institutions that Israel and the United States are trying to annihilate right now, because these are preventing them from claiming that the West Bank belonged to Israel. So what do? In order to claim that it is their territory, there is only one option: get rid of international law. And for that, they have the support of a few lawyers. And that is why we need to stand up. And, whatever your views on some of the intricacies, we need to understand the seriousness of what we are confronting, because there is no alternative. There is a destruction of everything that has been put together over 80 years to protect people, to ensure that there is some kind of red lines, that not everything is permissible. That is what Israel and the United States and a few other governments, sadly, I will say your president right now, are trying to destroy. They are trying to argue, this is a new era, we don't need it. Excuse me, the entire world needs it. The people that are vulnerable need it. The people that are the victims of conflict need it. and everyone that has a little bit of judgment needed, because there is nothing else to replace what has been created in 1948 and afterwards.
In recent months, there have been growing attacks on international legal institutions. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz invited Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, despite the ICC arrest warrant against him and Hamas leaders for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. In the US, Donald Trump imposed sanctions on 4 ICC judges and a prosecutor. How do you assess such actions? What dangers do these developments pose for the legitimacy and independence of international justice and the rule-based international order?
Yes. Well, more or less answer your question before. Look, I think what your chancellor did is absolutely shameful, and it needs to be said. It's shameful, and I hope the German people understand that when you invite someone who is accused of some of the worst crimes by an international court that was set up to protect the world, that chancellor, frankly, does not deserve the confidence of the people. That's my view. Okay, because these are absolutely central to the world that was built for you, for the generation, for the young generation as well. And there is no plan B. Let me reiterate. Guys that are intent on destroying the International Criminal Court, destroying the International Court of Justice, paralyzing the Security Council, rendering the United Nations completely unable to function. Those guys, they're all men, as far as I know. Those guys do not have a plan B. They don't have an alternative. They are only building chaos. That's all. It's chaotic. It's chaos. It's organized chaos for their own interest and their own greed, I will say. That is what is being built at the moment. And sadly, the German chancellor, who should know better, is becoming part of that. So it is incumbent upon you, young people, and any other people, in fact, in Germany, to stand up to that. It does not mean that the system worked well. It does not mean that, we need to protect everything. No, we should be open-minded. We need to recognize that transformation is part of how you adapt. For instance, climate. When 1948 was thought about, no one thought about climate change. So it's clear that the institutions created in 1948 may not be fully fit for some of the challenges of 2025. But you don't destroy the entire infrastructures. You don't destroy international justice. You don't destroy those mechanisms that are meant to protect a little bit what we can with peace and security. You do everything you can to make them work better. That is not what your chancellor has done when he invited Netanyahu. That is certainly not what Donald Trump is doing when he is sanctioning the International Criminal Court. They are destroying. They are destroying. They are creating chaos. And who will suffer? Who will suffer will be people like you, people like me, the vulnerable people in countries such as Gaza, in Sudan, and so on. These are the people who will suffer. So we need to stand up and we need to resist these attacks on our common humanity. We must resist. We must disrupt what they are trying to do. And we must transform what needs to be transformed. I'm a bit too old to do all of that, but I'm leaving that to you, and I know you will do a far better work than me. Thank you.
Maybe to add just the strong words of Agnès for the German situation, there is no discretion the German government has. They have to detain Netanyahu. So it's really undermining the system if he says there is no discretion. He has to. And the policeman who is there first when Netanyahu enters the country has There's no discretion, has to detain him. And I find it really terrible if the German government says, and recognizes this duty when Putin, according to Putin, when they speak about Putin, but when they talk about Netanyahu, they don't. And this is really undermining international law. If you don't have the same standards for everyone, and no one stands above the law, and that was a clear sign after 48 we had, but also with the introduction of the international criminal law and international criminal law, where Germany played a very important role to strengthen international criminal law and build an ICC. So it's really terrible that he now dismantles it and weakens it, erodes it in the way he does. So I fully agree with Agnès there.
In closing, do you have a final appeal to our listeners? Or final?
I've already told you. You need to resist. Resist those attacks, because you, young people, will be the first victims. The world we're giving you is in a mess, frankly. You should sue all of us for the damage that we have done. So, you need to work together. You cannot do that alone. Create collective, come together, but resist the undermining, the annihilation, the notion that you should be the silent witness of something and say nothing. And you need to disrupt if it's required. Disrupt them when they try to tell you can't do anything. Disrupt them when they try to say, this is the order and no one should disturb it. No, we need to disrupt. And then you need to transform, because that's not good. It's not just about resisting, disrupting, protecting. You also need to reimagine the world you want to live in. You need to transform the institutions when they don't deliver what's needed, and in particular when they don't deliver justice, when they don't deliver equality, when they don't deliver peace. It means they need to be transformed. And that, my dear friend, is going to be your role. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking that world that we left behind, which is not lovely looking, and make it a better place. Thank you.
Dr. Callamard, thank you so much for your insight and for joining us today.
Thank you also to you, Julia Duchrow.
Thank you very much for this great project and the interview. Thank you.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and stay curious, keep asking questions, and let's strive together for justice and peace.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.